Yes.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. A good morning, a good evening, and a good afternoon to wherever you are joining in from around the world today. Today we have a wonderful webinar hosted by KFUPM Business School, and today it's on digital transformation and innovation. And we're having two very special guests coming in from two sides of the world. We have Mr. Mustafa Ahmed, who is a lecturer at KFUPM Business School, and he's also the founder and CEO of Ascend E-Ventures. And we have a very special guest from across the world, from South America, specifically from Chile, Mr. Martin, who is the Senior Vice President of Nisum International. He's also the General Manager of Nisum in South America. And I'd like to welcome both of you on board for this special first-time occasion that we're having both Nisum and Ascend coming together with us at KFUPM and in Saudi Arabia. So welcome on board, gentlemen. And I'd like to thank everyone else also who is here with us today. Thank you for taking your time out. And I hope you have a very insightful webinar today that you learn something out of and we can apply and implement, especially with the pandemic going on. And I hope all of you are staying safe, keeping well, and maintaining your social distancing and wearing masks at all times. Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I'll pass it over to you, Mr. Mustafa.
Thank you. Thank you, Taha. Thanks everyone for joining today. Most of us are on campus, so dear Martin, he's joining us from South America, from Chile. So welcome, Martin. Great to collaborate with you on this wonderful platform. Thank you, Taha, for the introduction. Just a quick background on why Nisum is presenting. So I had the opportunity of meeting with Nisum CEO and with Nisum CEO's advisor, Carlos Lewit, and a few senior managers in Dubai at a business conference, a digital business conference. And so we got to talking, and I was looking at, just talking about e-commerce, and Nisum is one of those companies that, it's a privilege to work with because they are behind some of the largest e-commerce businesses in the United States. So they do the heavy lifting, they do the back end work. So I got to talking about my e-commerce class and a course that I teach, plus a site that I always visit first time. It's williamsonoma.com. It's kitchenware, one of these really, it's my favorite website for a decade. And then I found out that Nisum is one of the companies that is behind Williams-Sonoma and Macy's and Gap. So I was just like, wow. So it was really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk to this company. And so I met with Imtiaz and Carlos and a few of the senior managers, and it was just a pleasure to meet with this very leading edge company, extremely capable, and probably one of the most down-to-earth teams I have ever met. So it was just a pleasure and really great to meet with the team. And I want to thank, Bakhtiar from Nisum, Taha and Ehab and Amutha and Carlos and Imtiaz, everyone involved so far to be able to make this happen. So thank you, everyone. Appreciate taking time to attend this. We try to make it a little bit interactive. So, Martin needs no introduction. And Martin, the floor is yours. And I just have a few questions that, we'll just go through the slides, and then definitely the chat room is open. If somebody has a question, we'll definitely would like to address those. And we'll just see how it goes. So maybe, interactively we'll start. So Martin, the floor is yours, and I'll be driving these slides, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, thank you very much, Mustafa, for such a wonderful introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a true honor. I know we've been working in getting this together for a long time, and I am very excited to see so many participants in here to discuss about digital transformation, innovation, particularly with everything that's been going around. I think that when we started thinking about collaborating and having these types of discussions, there was a lot going around, and then the pandemic came, and that's like, it multiplied by 10. So we can start moving forward, but I'm very excited about sharing. I would invite everybody to make the best use we have of these new digital technologies. So if you do want to participate, you want to ask a question, you want to raise a point on something that we're discussing, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll see you in the participants blog and try to have the conversation, or feel free to write in the chat. And I'll do my best to keep a dual attention to the chat and the presentation. And if I miss it, I'm sure someone will call it to my attention. So without no further ado, the idea today is to get a glimpse about what is going on, over the last year or two, I will say. How does our view of digital and the effect it's having in the war happening? And I'd like to start with this slide, which, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And when we're thinking about the level of disruption that we've been seeing, I like this comparison of the twister versus the hurricane, right? So, and the difference is they're both very devastating natural events, similar to, much in line with all the climate changes that we are facing. But one is devastating. It comes unexpectedly out of nowhere, right? And it's very devastating in a particular area, right? So the rise of new e-commerce channels created a huge disruption within the retail industry, for example, or similar in some, when you think back to 10, 15 years, similar new technologies were coming that truly disrupted specific industry, specific areas. Sometimes they came over time, but most likely what was going to happen, you can think about the picture with the digital pictures, you can think about e-commerce and so on, but usually it was like very disruptive, many times unexpected for those not in industry, and completely disruptive in that particular area. What we're seeing today is that this is more of a hurricane, right? So if you're in the path during this war, it just comes and it stays here and goes all around, right? So if you are, I don't know, whatever new digital giants, you see them across multiple industries, constantly innovating, pushing the boundaries. If you are an incumbent or a true leader of industry today, you see these changes coming from everywhere and constantly. So the way we adapt, the way we think about disruption, it has a much faster pace and a much broader effect. So that raises the question of what do we do and how do we think about it, right? And there's some examples on how we can see this. Some stuff if we can continue to advance a little bit, right? How does this accelerate, particularly in this last year, right? Some of my data is going to be US based, mostly because best sources of information or easier to access information is there. A lot of public information, a lot of focus, and we are in academia, in our MBA areas, we love to talk about the hockey stick, right? So when you're trying to start a company and sell a company, you do your sales prediction, and it usually looks like, we grew 10% here, 10% here, but next year we're going to do 50 and then 100, and you get this hockey stick. And usually the hockey stick happens when you look into the future, right? When you're looking into those predictions. But this is a wonderful example of a real life hockey stick. And you can see how digital has penetrated the market as a percentage of overall sales since the early 2000s at a very steady pace. Some jumps there in the the early 2018s and so on. But obviously, from the 6, it doubled, right? From 6 to 12, if you do kind of quick math, between 2000, let's say, call it 10 to 2020. So in 10 years, it doubled, right? And then we went from 12 to, from 11-ish to 17, 18 in 9 months. So you can imagine the level of disruption when you have one full decade into 9 months or a year, the level of disruption and changes that brings. And it's not only, you say, okay, that's on the business side. When we look at people's life, if we go to the next slide, right, you can see another very interesting, Mustafa, if we can move to the next slide, please. There you go. So on our side, on the people side, another big disruption that shows up in the statistics, right? So this is the percentage of personal savings rates that people have between again, mid 2015 or so to today, and you can see, we usually, again, this is US data, but I'm going to bring some global data into this as well. And you can see how it's usually in that 7 to 8 to 9%, right? And then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and people are saving 33% of their income, right? And usually savings rates don't move much because obviously your life, you have your expenses and your savings and it keeps going. And when you aggregate in a big number of people, I mean, think about it, this, has to go over hundreds of millions of people. Making those sort of changes is very disruptive and very, very difficult, right? Usually you will see it in a recession, the saving rates goes a little bit higher because people are afraid more fearful of what the future will bring, right? And then when things are good, people tend to spend more and then you save less or invest more, and so you save less, but in that range, right? And then it comes to this like 30%, haven't seen in many, many decades number, which means like, what are people going to do in the next few years with all that money that's saved? And a lot of this was driven by the fearfulness people were having about things that were happening. A lot of it was driven by, all the closings that were driven by the pandemic, right? So now you can't travel. So there's a lot of money that people used to do for vacations and things like that that are not spending. You can go to restaurants, you can go to entertainment spaces. The way you used to shop changed. So until you readapt, you're spending less and so on and so forth. And this is US, but similar rates across the world, right? So if you take those numbers to European Union countries, it was around 26% by the end of 2020. If you take the United Kingdom, it was at 28. Japan was at 22, which was the largest in 2 decades. So it's the same thing all across the world. The peak was the US at 33%, but all across the world, you can see how these things happen. So if we go to the next slide, again, if there are questions, and I say a comment there that I was going to say on the chat. It is true. One caveat that is not mentioned, so thanks for bringing it to my attention. A lot of people lost their jobs, right? So when you look at the overall economy, so we discussed a little bit on the business side, on the people side, if you look at the whole economy, economies as a whole, and we discussed this a little bit specific to Middle East, decrease in the overall, so the level of the economic GDP growth decreased mostly across the world. So yes, we obviously had also less money to spend overall, but that less of that, let's call it a smaller pie, we spend less of it too. A lot of it went to savings. That was trying to be my point, but thanks for pointing that out. So what is, how do we, again, the question is, how do we think of this? Because the accelerated rate of change and future uncertainty, what it does is forces us to rethink how we think about our companies, right? And we got to be honest with ourselves. Accelerate rate of change is not a new concept that we're bringing. We've probably been talking about, uncertainty and change for the better part of the last couple of decades, right? So it's not something new, but the increased level of uncertainty, just not the change, but also uncertainty of the future, and the constantly growth of that change pace means we need to ask ourselves, how do we coexist in this new reality, right? So a lot of the questions at the beginning of the pandemic is, well, when do we get back to normal? Then it was, how do we get back to a new normal? And nowadays it's more like, how do we create a new normal, right? What is that new future going to look like? As with many changes, the key part, again, in the context of, I want to provide some context because there's a lot of important plans for the health part, from a personal perspective, from an economical perspective, from a government perspective, but from a business perspective, from a digital perspective, right? The most important part is recognizing that this is a reality, that we need to live with it, and try to understand it, because from a good diagnosis, then we can create a good strategy, and then we can start moving forward. And then that means that in the future, we'll just need to be more nimble, more agile, more willing to transform. And this overall digital transformation idea moves from, transforming our current business to deal with reality into transforming into organizations that are constantly going to change, right? So I'm gonna just some examples, right? Most of us work differently than we used to do just 2 years ago, either because it's remote, either because we communicate differently, either because we do it with different goals and in different contexts and in different economic agreements, right? So it's not just that it's remotely, it's different from many perspectives, right? And the adaptation period for that change was very low, and it had a ton of repercussions, impacts, let's call it, right? And we need to start asking ourselves, what were the technologies that enabled that, right? How were we able to do that? Who gets to win from this change, and how are they going to win? So if we keep asking ourselves those questions, we start finding those opportunities and those ways forward into what do we want to do, right? And when we get to that point, and now we can move over, Mustafa. Sorry, I went a little bit, I extended that a little bit more. I just wanted to make some points. But if we find those questions, right, if we find those opportunities, it means that we need to start thinking about how do we align the way we work, our company culture, right? Because again, as we said, this new technology is not just impacting what we do, but how we do it and how we think about it with our strategies. And we'll go a little bit deeper into that, but like, what does this new reality mean from a strategic, both at a business level and technology level point of view, and in many cases, our business models. So the way we generate value for our customers and our communities also needs to change. And the most relevant part here is when we try to align those, that we need to do is innovate. That willingness to change, to constantly test our theories, prove them in our companies, in our communities, in our markets, and test them early so we can strengthen our value proposition. It's a constant, and I will say obsessive look for that adaptability and willingness to change.
Sounds good. Martin, let me just ask you a question here. We have a room full of budding entrepreneurs, and what areas that you have noticed, and we can discuss, for example, what areas would you advise our students to sort of consider if they're venturing out into a digital space, and in this very disruptive time, what should they consider in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of starting something? Any pointers you would like to share with our students?
That is awesome question. Brings me back to my earlier years, and I will say that so I'm gonna go sideways here a little bit, but I think what was true all the time, and is more true than ever in today's world, from an entrepreneurial perspective, is the opportunity obsessiveness. So as I was discussing before, there is a massive shift in the way we're doing and thinking about our industries, our business, our communities, our countries, our interactions. And the level of disruption that we all had to go through, right? So again, on that twister versus hurricane idea that everybody had to go, not just the business side, the people, the countries, everybody had to go through, means that there is an openness for new things that was not always there, right? So that brings a lot of different opportunities. I have a slide on some of those trends, right? But
sure,
wherever you are thinking about when you're starting your business, is like, where are those opportunities and why are they important? And then aligning that with something that you are truly passionate about, or that you really like, or you really have the willingness to really pursue it, I think that is where you'll find. I think we need to be conscious that technology will be a great enabler of opportunity, but rarely will be a big driver of those opportunities. There are some, right? There are some at the cutting edge of technology. There's definitely some, but I would say, most of the cases, it will be a huge enabler of opportunities. And making that bridge between the technology and the business, that's where a lot of the opportunities lie. How do we implement those? And how do we bring those to market?
And I think, Martin, you said it right there. It's, it's the technology is the enabler. It allows you to do your disruption, right? And it should never be the other way around. You should not be limited by the technology. So this is why, when we look at sites, some of the sites that, you guys are building, you have sites that are so native, so natural. It's like they are already thinking about what your next click is going to be on, and they present you with a very relevant, very appropriate content, right? So and those super apps, those apps that we are constantly glued to, is because that experience, they provide that experience where the teams have built something that is right on target in terms of what this market needs. That's why, it's a wonderful time for disruption. I appreciate you covering that.
Yeah, and on those technologies, I think I'll come back to that a bit later, right? But there are some technologies that are really coming out there in ways we haven't thought about it before, right? So when we think about AI, right? So we think about robots, we think about, human interaction and so on. A very interesting startup, recent unicorn here in Latin America that I just came across is using AI to create new foods, writing this whole, the overall consciousness about the value of food, its impact on environment, and the trying to replace some of our meat-based diets with vegetable-based diets. They are using artificial intelligence. We come to how do we create better food with using better ingredients better, right? So again, I'm bringing this up not because I have any particular interest in this company, but using technology as an enabler, an entrepreneur that is opportunity obsessed, looking at those big world trends, where are we going, and something he's passionate about, that's a good alignment. And I think that, like those, you can find multiple examples, but I think it brings to life what you were just saying, Mustafa. That's why I'm bringing that up. And as we're doing that, if we take all we've been discussing for granted, and you give me the benefit of the doubt and say, like, okay, that sounds probably reasonable, right? The question becomes, what do we do about it? And obviously what we need to do is learn to write in these new times, and how do we do that? And not long ago, within the last year, I was preparing for a similar presentation, not exactly this one. It was interesting because it was called Innovation 2050, so it was kind of deeper into the future look. And I was like, okay, that sounds challenging because, I don't usually think about the next 30 years. When we do our plans, it's either 1 year, 5 years, maybe 10 years, but 30 years into the future for our companies seems a lot. And I came into a very, very interesting TED Talk that I'm going to recommend right here. It's a presentation by a person called Martin Reeves. And his presentation is how to build a business that lasts 100 years. So 100 years will put us, just for, because it sounds really great, but it will put us right into 2121, which is way into the future, right? And I don't think most of us think about our future companies that we're starting right now into, what are we going to do in 2121? And as I always like to say, as our dear departed Lord Keynes used to say, in the long term, we're all dead. So by 2021, 2121, we're not here. But that doesn't mean it's not an interesting question and not a valid question. So help us think, beyond what we're going to do next year, beyond this level of disruptiveness that we're seeing before. If you think about the war, you can do the exercise the other way around and think about the war in 1921. 100 years ago, and you can see how different that is, right? And not just our latest digital disruption. If you go back all the way to 1921, then you start finding a lot of difference, right? And we do today. And the reason it's visible today as well is because our companies are at a bigger risk that they've been in at least quite some time. I don't know how far back, but the average lifespan of a listed company in the US today, again, US has probably the better data, but the average lifespan of a company, of a publicly traded company, so we're talking about larger companies here, is only 30 years. So a company that is on the stock market today is expected to not exist within 30 years on average. And that could be because either that, not that they're going to go bankrupt, but either they acquire, they merge, they transform or something else, but they're not there anymore. And as a comparison, in 1970, so about 40 years ago, that was 60 years. So we cut our company's lives in half in only 40 years. But if you keep looking deeper into that, right? The expectation is that in the next 5 years, 1/3 of the 35,000 companies that are listed in the market will cease to exist. So that's about 10,000 companies in the next 5 years. 10,000 of the largest companies on the globe will cease to exist on the next 5 years. That probability the probability of, I read that wrong, sorry. The probability of those 35 companies, 1/3, used to be 10%. So we triple the rate of probability of the companies ceasing to exist by 3. So anyway, I thought it was super interesting on when we're facing this much uncertainty on such short periods of time to start thinking about, okay, what does that mean in the long term? And how do I prepare? As I'm starting, right, as you say, Mustafa, we're here with a great group of future entrepreneurs. So the challenge that he poses, which is very interesting, is like, okay, how do you think about your company when you're starting to build those initial building blocks? How is that going to survive for the long term, right? And he follows a very interesting model. I have a slide on that later to just, give a glimpse, and I invite everybody to look at the sector, which is very interesting. But basically, he compares to how do we survive as living organisms. He's a biologist originally, right? Then came to a business world. Compares, and I'll give you some pointers on what does that mean.
Cool.
Not again for everything, but again, is how do we ride in these times of uncertainty, right? So I want to put some examples into this because we've been discussing quite a few ideas at this point. Here's one dear to my heart. First, because I really like Disney movies, to be honest. So it's always nicer to talk about things you use and you watch, right? But again, going back to this new level of disruption and this need for level of adaptability and rethink as we said, right? We look at Disney. I don't know if you know, or how much you know about it, but 2 of Disney's largest business units, theme parks and movies, completely closed. And not just, again, on this idea of across, broader disruption, not just close in Southeast United States because of security, close across the globe. Most countries close movie theaters. And I would say most countries where Disney-owned theme parks close the ability to open. I mean, that they have reopened by now, but put yourself about 9 months ago, right? So how do you react to that when your 2 largest businesses? We can do the same on the airline industry, hotel industry, and so on. But I found that what Disney did was very interesting, which is it created a new company on the fly that basically competes with itself, right? Because if you think about it, and you're starting to see some of the fallout from that now that we're reopening, and they have lawsuits with their own actors and things like that. But when you think about Disney Plus, which got to like, I think something like 94 million subscribers very quickly, competes with its movie business, right? And they created new content, and the Hamilton was very famous on what they used to do, on how you attract with content. They become a content company, and they go to compete head-to-head with Amazon and Netflix, as opposed to, it's more current lay of competitors of Warner Brothers and Paramount and so on, right? So on the fly, they have to create this. So what I invite you to think about is not like, oh yeah, great success case, which is interesting and so on, but the invitation is to think about how hard do you think that is as a company to create this whole new thing that is on a new business model that clearly needs different level of talent, right? A lot more technology on a different type of technology, a different sales process, a different, if you compare to business, a lot more out there with, the B2C model. Think about the level of disruption that you have to have internally that has come from the exterior, right? And that's the level of adaptability that we need to start thinking we're going to have. Obviously, at our own scale, right? This is a mammoth of a company, but even at that level, you start to see those things, which I think is truly reflective of the things that we were discussing, right? That's a great global example. When we get a little bit closer to home, Mustafa, if we move forward. Again, if someone has thoughts, questions around, I see the concurrent with the statement. I've been talking quite a bit. I'm glad to see. I'm not sure which statement, to be honest, but appreciate the thoughts. And if anyone wants to, share some thoughts or anything, please feel free to either write or raise your hand, and we'll go through there. But when we get closer to home in the MENA region, level of disruption, everything we just said, right? And huge impact on the level of oil demand, which we know continues to drive, at least up to today, a lot of the economy in the region, right? And I'm not gonna, I'm gonna pretend to be the foremost experts in the MENA ecosystem of startups or economists, but I've been working with the region for the last couple of years, so you tend to read a lot and try to get up to date, and what you find is again this level of disruption that force governments to create these stimulus packages, which are all across the globe, and in the short term you still see this recovery tied to oil prices as expected, right? Again, this thinking about putting ourselves back in the mid of 2020, but enormous diversification efforts on the economy that were there before. They were there before, but accelerate. And then investments go wider in nature, they go faster, and they go more aggressive, right? And we have the Vision 2030 for Saudi. It did not come with the pandemic. It just fills with a level of acceleration, and it adds a level of urgency that truly helps drive what we're going to see in the future, and that really sustain on the really sustain on using technologies as enablers. So I think that is something that I've seen in the region again and again that I think is truly commendable, which is the understanding of new technologies as enablers of new industries to drive that diversification in the future. I'm going to take 1 second of a pause because I did see a comment from Khalid, and I agree. Disney Plus used Netflix business model with a lot more recognizable content for the audience, I will say, with brands from Marvel and Disney and so on. But a point that I wanted to make, and I bring back the Disney thing because I think there's a very interesting point in there. Innovation, when we're looking at our own companies, it's not just innovation from this has never been done before, disruptive innovation, but a lot of it is it's never been done in our company. So while it was Netflix's business model, it was a completely new business model for Disney. So for Disney, even though it doesn't change the landscape, right? It's not bringing something else. It disrupted anyway. It has, I will argue, a bigger disruption within Disney, right? Huge disruption within there, and also changed a lot of the landscape of the streaming wars, right? Because Disney did it, Amazon did it as well. It's competed in there with Amazon Prime. And then now we have a lot of other smaller ones that are trying to come into that. And then, I don't know, I honestly don't know the local ones, but you have Hulu, you have Paramount, you have Warner Brothers, you have HBO, and everybody's trying to create their own platform. Disney, of all those ones, just jumped in first, which was very interesting. Beyond Amazon, but Amazon is Amazon. I think it's a story in itself. So as we go through this diversification, if we go to the next one, and we think about it, right? What does that look like, right? And what we see is a lot more investment in the digital. I'm talking about, where will you go? Where will you go? Mustafa, you asked me, like, if you were an investor, if you were starting something, where will you go, right? Sure. So, yeah. Well, looking at the numbers is always interesting, right? So look at those levels of investments into automation, software, hardware, basically technology-enabled changes, right? That looks like a very interesting area to me, because those percentages translate into a lot of investment and dollars and so on, right? So very interesting. There were a lot of investment in the startup world in the region. I think that when you look at this, there's been a lot of investment in startups across the globe, and a lot of that was there before the pandemic and then accelerates after because of all this disruption, those opportunity that you start seeing. And sectors, again, you have your logistics. Logistics has been incredible, right? Because all this move that we saw, that hockey stick at the beginning, shopping online is really nice, right? And creating a storefront that allows you to buy something is relatively easy. I would say somewhere between easy and very easy. Now, making that work, that is very hard. That part of actually getting the right product to the right person at the right time, that's why you see big investments around logistics and around platforms and software and so on, because that part is tough. Food tech, I mentioned it before. There's a lot of going on the food side. Fintech is disruptive because everybody wants to get in there because it's an industry on the financial services side that hasn't innovated in a while. So obviously it's ripe for a lot of opportunities. Mobility, e-commerce, there's a lot of other ones, right? Agri-tech is huge too. As we try to improve those things and so on. So a lot of different areas, but again, the important part, right, is like what does this mean and what do we take from there? I see a comment in there that 1921 to 2021 is very different development than 2021 from 21. If you do know how 21 is going to look like, Faisal, I will appreciate that. I have no idea. I would agree that it will be very different, but it will be different in the same way that 1821 was definitely very different to 1921 to 2021. I think when you take 100-year increments, you see a lot of changes. Maybe not as much in the 1500s, but in these centuries, I think that's true. But I think it's one thing of us. One thing that we learned is a lot of this, we don't know what we don't know. And this is something that I'm going to delve a little bit more going forward. I need to start going a little faster. I got very excited. I know we got 20 minutes left.
It's okay.
So I'm going to pass through this one relatively quick. This was a little bit about what you asked me before, right? What are some of those trends, right? A lot of augmented reality, that melting of the digital and analog world. A lot of expectation on that. That technology has been around for a long time, and it goes back to, okay, but what does that mean? The fact that the technology is there means nothing until someone figures out what does that mean, how that enables something different. And there's been a lot of interesting developments in the last, I would say, 18 to 24 months, driven by a lot of people coming into the digital world, forced to come into the digital world and creating something very interesting. Digital wallets, and I would say, I will go a little bit further, digital payments in general, driving huge investments. And that is driven by, again, all these people coming to interact online, and then how do they pay? And what happens to cash? And what happens to cryptocurrencies and things like that? It's huge. Green businesses, big push on that as well, right? We know we have a climate change challenge that is enormous, and there is push from governments on this area. There's push from the civil organizations, non-governmental organizations, supranational organizations. And what does the business world ask about it? How do we create business that are sustainable, have the triple impact perspective, and so on? Very, very interesting as well, and it's going to be a lot more. And the last one I'm going to touch upon is one that is very dear to my heart because I suffer this every day. There's just a statistic in there about the shortage of IT professionals, but all of these technologies sound great. And what we're missing the most is people that can actually create them. So everybody wants to do new technologies, technology-enabled practices, and so on. Incumbents wants to transform, which requires a lot of people to drive those technologies. Entrepreneurs want to disrupt, which requires a lot of people to drive those technologies. And, you know, the private universities, to be honest, are not keeping up. Sorry to bring that up in the academia world, but the truth is we're not keeping up. And how we're going to solve, how to solve that problem, if you're talking about, you know, opportunity obsession, if you can solve that problem, there's a huge opportunity in there, because nowadays we don't develop enough talent to face the challenges that we pose to ourselves. So there's a lot of areas where you can look at these trends or on what's coming. Very interesting. Again, due to time, I'll just keep moving forward a little bit on how we'll go.
This is Martin Reeves that you mentioned before.
I mentioned before, I'll just go very quickly. Again, what he does is he goes through comparing the human system to organizations. So he talks about these 6 areas to work under uncertainty. He talks, I invite you again to look at the presentation, but he talks about redundancy, right? So basically, if you look at our system, there's a lot of redundancies, millions of copies of every component on our immune system to do the same job. So redundant is expensive, but it helps you, it helps you when bad things happen to have a backup plan. It talks about diversity and different approaches to the similar things. And that talks about, I think that one is so key, right? It's not to get bogs into the one approach thing to here's the solution, but that open-mindedness to be able to move forward. Modularity, it's something that I read it here first, and then you keep seeing it come up again and again and again. But how do you keep the different parts of our organizations fit like modules that can be, detached and attached together? Really key. And what I think is the biggest one, which is adaptation, and being able to adapt constantly to changes in the environment. And probably that's the most important. The one that caught my attention quite a bit was prudence. He has a great example about a Japanese company that lasted hundreds and hundreds of years, and then they took a ginormous loan to pursue a big opportunity, and then defaulted on it and disappeared. So, when we always talk about that aggressiveness to pursue opportunities, prudence is a very interesting principle to continuously, keep that mind check about what we're truly doing, and then embed yourself in the ecosystem. Embeddedness is the last one. Again, truly inspirational stuff. Not all applicable, obviously, right? It was very specific, but the good part of this is how do I take some of these learnings to better understand what I'm trying to deal with from the environment. Cool. So again, all of that, if we move to the next one, I will say all of that is super interesting. And when I was listening to it, my thought was like, okay, super interesting, but very in the theory side, in the academia side, something like, Mustafa and I can sit on a classroom and debate for hours, but the question becomes again, okay, he's talking about all these theory things that I don't really know how to apply on the day-to-day, and he's thinking about that for the next 100 years, right? So how do we keep perspective, right? And how do we adapt to a future that we thought was in the future and then accelerate on that future came in today? And so we need to understand technology, its complexity, the environment, the constant change, and understand that change our organization today. And what it changed into, and I alluded to this before, and I will be very clear about this, what it alludes to from what a digital transformation should really be, at least in my perspective, is transform our company or our organization into an organization that transforms itself. So at the end of the journey, hopefully what we did is learn to constantly evolve and adapt. And to do that, there's key areas that we'll have to work on, right? There is the organizational culture and new practices, right? So it implies our people, our way of working. It goes everywhere from our compensation policy to the different processes, from how we lead to how we upskill. The holistic view of the company needs to be in line on an organization that transforms. It would imply shifting our strategy to take the best out of those enabled technologies and constantly pursue opportunities. It would imply, obviously, our IT infrastructure, but I will say the key in today's, from a digital transformation perspective, at least today, is that data-driven culture. How do we transform into organizations that really leverage the data to drive decisions and constantly improve? A lot more customer centricity. This has been there for a while, but again, this globalized world more than ever, from a business perspective at least, means that our customers further understand what's out there, right? So that customer centricity becomes a key, and that agile perspective, right, of constantly focusing on value and in incremental tested growth will be key to bring it all together. So some of the key areas that I found that, if properly aligned, allows you to transform an organization that transforms. I'm going to take a leap of faith here, Mustafa. I'm going to close with this one, given time. So we have 10 minutes for Q&A. I know there's some other material, but I think it's a good idea. And I wanted to close with a quote that I found very interesting that comes from what we've been discussing. And it has to do with some of the impacts that this have, right? Because all we've been discussing have deep impacts, right? And so when we start constantly transforming internally, and we change the way we manage, and we start learning on how to be more resilient to the changes, and we change our business models, and we further the frontier of what we consider to be our working area, that means that now industries are in our own minds, and who we are and what we do starts to be defined by our own limits that we put. And you see this day in and day out, you see more and more often of companies that expand beyond their capabilities. They go into new industries. And if you look at the ecosystem of any of your digital natives, you start seeing that they are competing in anything that you want to think, right? And so the future of business looks very, very, very different. And I will say, there was another phrase in there that I really like, that to take hold of that future, the biggest challenge is, or the biggest winners are companies that move quickly and decisively. And that implies that whatever we're doing, we do it now and we do it big. And I think that's the invitation. I'm hoping that everybody got an interesting perspective. I tried to brought some of the examples and ideas of things that are going on, some of the challenges that we are seeing, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions that there may be, or take on any comments that anyone will have. I would love to hear some perspectives of what you guys are seeing around all of this.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. So the floor is open. We have a little bit of time. So any insights, anything that anybody wants to discuss or have a question about, please feel free. And we have the instructors also here for the courses. So anybody that's interested, please do mention. Right, so we have a question from Faisal Ahmed, right?
Yeah.
Do you think there's a cap to the? Yeah, good.
No, go ahead. You can read it so everybody can
Yes,
see
do you think
it.
there's a cap to the? Do you think there's a gap to the digital and technological development, and have we reached the top of, or even close to the top of that development? Right? Is there, interesting?
It's a very interesting question. I think that this is a personal perspective, but caps are difficult to define, right? Because usually what tends to happen with technology, again, if you take a longer perspective, what tends to happen to technology is a new technology, kind of truly disruptive, paradigm changing technology, let's call it, arrives. And then you have a lot of development on top of that development. And you could say we're still on, the automation microprocessor computers development, and we still have ways to go, and we're in the same. What's going to be the now? If you go further, right, was the engine. If you go before that, all the way until you get to the fire, and then you develop around those new technologies, right? So have we reached the cap on this digital where we are right now with everything that's going on the cloud, AI, and so on? Probably not. I would argue no. There's a lot of interesting things happening on the edge of that, on edge computer, on quantum computing. And the implication mostly around AI that I think has way to go, both from particularly technology perspective as well as their business implications, which is what drives us today. There's a bunch of other ones, but I think there is still a way to go. But the most interesting question will be, what comes after that, right? What is that thing? I think the interesting part about the future is that truly embracing the idea of not knowing what we don't know. So when you talk about putting a cap on that development, you could answer that questions on what we know that we don't know. Like how far can we bring AI, right? That's something that we know about. We don't know the answer maybe, and I can have some idea. The question is, we don't know what different paradigm shifting technologies out there. So I will think that if you take the last few hundred years or a couple thousand years as evidence, or if you want to go further, you can. I would argue that no, and that again, we don't know what we don't know, and that development continues to be there. And again, that opportunity obsessiveness of constantly looking at how that impacts our lives. I think that that will continue to advance. If okay, there's a question about going back to normal reality from Omar. To be honest, Omar, I don't really know what normal reality is anymore. I don't think anyone does. I don't think. If you ask me, I will say no. I will say there will be a different normal. I think there's always a normal. Today's normal for the last 18 months have been abnormal for what we used to, but it was the new reality for what we're living. And do I think that we'll be living, in constant quarantines for the next 50 years? I will hope not. I will think no, but I will also hope not. But once we get out of here, the level of disruptiveness, and I just show a couple of graphs, right? But you can look at it from multiple perspectives. And I think the impact has been deep enough that reality will be different from what we were used to. In good ways, in bad ways, I think that depends on perspective, but I think there will be different.
Also, Martin, one more thing, just regarding Omar's question regarding, the normal, the reality. So, for example, at Nisum, you are managing the largest sites, as I mentioned, and you do that remotely, right? So, and you've been doing that prior to the pandemic. You manage, you work, you build in remote teams, And so this is nothing new so it depends on who the norm is for, kind of thing.
Yeah, super interesting point too, right? But I would argue we had a very interesting discussions about it, when we were in the midst of it, right? I think the big difference is most businesses had some sort of remote work in place, right? I will argue most businesses in Saudi interacted with countries outside of Saudi doing remote work. I think the key difference that brought the pandemic is we moved from a remote work, collocated work, to a distributed workforce where basically everyone is their own office, right? So, for example, I had about 200 people, 70 of who were working for US customers, right? All of them remotely, but collocated. They all work here. Now I have those same 70 people working in 70 different offices that are interacting with another 70, 100, 500 people working in, and now even in multiple countries, not just in the same city, right? Different countries, different states within the states, and so on and so forth. So the level of disruption there has been huge. We don't know where that's going. There's a lot of interesting theories, if that's something that interests you, about how to work remotely. A lot of discussion in there, and I found it completely interesting because it affects the way we live, right? It's the way we work and the way we live and the way we think about business. But I don't know if anyone has the right answer yet. I think I don't think that domino has fallen. I think that is still a TBD, to be honest.
Sure, I think so. Someone else has a question regarding, what do you think of Visa business model as a, chaotic organization? And if you have any thoughts on how Visa is, how are they changing into a new area of business?
I will have to be fully honest here, Mustafa. I don't have a position on this. I haven't looked at it. I would love to have the conversation later to further understand, where we're going with this. I think digital payments as a whole, very disruptive business, ripe for new entrants. I haven't read as much, to be honest, about Visa and how they're going with it. But clearly, a very interesting challenge in there. I think payment has become an area that is driving huge amount of investment. If you look at any reports from, if you look at any of the reports that aggregate kind of investment per area within fintech, digital payments is attracting a lot of investment. It's not my foremost area of expertise, I think, but obviously, again, it's all driven by this disruption, right? All these people that double in size in digital transactions means that someone needs to process that, and someone needs to make sure that works well, and so on and so forth. I don't know enough about Visa to honestly have an opinion on that.
Sure. I think one last question: what industries have data which we can analyze to find solutions that create an opportunity? So, data-driven.
Well, in there, I think today, I would say most industries have that data. The question is, how do you transform that data into information? Anywhere. So, for example, and what I'm going with this, there is an open database of astronomical information that is global from all the telescopes that put that data publicly. And it's not something that you will usually think about. Okay, here's a bunch of data. Well, that data is there. You can think about financial services, which has a ton of data that you probably would not get access to, but has a huge amount of data on how we're behaving and how that's and they tend to be more protected because they have personal information and so on. I think the data perspectives, if you truly look for it, I will think nowadays most industries will have the data. Not everyone has the access to it, but most industries where you have that data, they find the solutions to create an opportunity. I will say, I would just invite Khalid to think about it differently, which is find an opportunity so we can create a solution. Because if you're starting with the solution, you're going to be, a nail looking for a hammer, and you want to be the hammer looking for the different nails. So I would just switch that and ask you to look for an opportunity so you can create a solution.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think it's a good place to conclude I'd like to thank everyone, Taha, Bakhtiar, Ihab, and the team here at KBS and at Nisum that have been helping to make this happen. And we hope to conduct a few more webinars on subjects and topics that are very, very relevant as we are into this phase that seems to be just, we're into this pandemic. No one knows, is it out or whatever it is, but we will try to do our best to do the best we can during the most interesting of circumstances. So we'll have other webinars and we'll look forward to inviting everyone. And I want to thank Martin again. Thank you for your time. And I think it'll be very, very insightful. I learned a lot, and we hope that we can invite you back and do this again. Thank you, Amutha. Thank you, Bakhtiar. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
It was an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much for the invite. Thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful questions. I hope I was able to bring some insights into them. I truly enjoyed the time, so I appreciate everyone's participation, and especially Taha, Mustafa. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the audience.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you.